Welcome, and thank you for joining us today on the Rider University Network special on Darfur. I'm your host, Matt Semel. Today I'm joined by filmmaker and author of Darfur Diaries, Jen Marlowe. Thank you, Jen, for joining us. How are you?
Doing okay, Matt. Thanks for having me on the show.
Not a problem. Okay, so my first question for you today is, can you just explain for anybody that doesn't know what the current situation in Darfur is?
Sure. Yeah, the current situation, what we're seeing happening now in Darfur, really got its start in 2003, where a group of rebels in the Darfur region in western Sudan took up arms against a government that's based in the capital in Khartoum that has a history of decades and decades of oppression and marginalization of basically of all people who are not from the privileged elite group of tribes that make up the government. Darfur certainly is not the only region of Sudan that's experienced that kind of marginalization and oppression, but it's been the most recent crisis of a series of crises in the country. So rebels in Darfur took up arms trying to demand equality and equal rights. What's happening in Darfur can really be understood as an incredibly brutal counterinsurgency campaign where the government targeted not just the rebels who were attacking them and attacking their army, but targeted really all the civilians from whom they believed the rebels were drawing their support. So the government began a scorched earth policy of burning down villages, murder, killing, burning down villages, and probably most disastrously was unleashing proxy militias, which are known as the Janjaweed. And these are the militias that the government armed, trained, and essentially serving as their proxies, set loose against civilians in villages. So it's resulted in deaths of hundreds of thousands, millions of people displaced, thousands and thousands of villages burned down. Rape has been, a very disturbing element of what's happening, mass rape of women and girls, refugees pouring over into Chad. And sadly, here in 2008, it's still an ongoing crisis.
Wow. Okay. And what was your experience? Well, actually, my next question is, what has been done and what is being done to help stop this crisis going on in Darfur?
Unfortunately, not enough. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. The United Nations has really been largely impotent. And part of that is due to how the United Nations is constructed. The most powerful organ in the United Nations the one that should be the most powerful is the UN Security Council. And the Security Council is made up of 15 member states, but 10 of them rotate, and only 5 of them hold permanent seats, and that's the US, France, the UK, China, and Russia. And rather than looking out really after international well-being and protection of civilians and all the things that, according to the UN Charter, should be their priority, they end up looking out after national interest. And so, especially, for example, for China and Russia, their national interest has them really aligned with the Sudanese government. The U.S. government has taken the lead rhetorically in the UN in terms of making statements, but in terms of actually any kind of substantive action, I think, first of all, the U.S.'s moral credibility, in the world is certainly not strong right now, and there's been, very little concrete action.
Okay, well, you had just mentioned China, so what do you think China is going to start doing responding to international pressure with the Sudanese government, because they do have a lot of economic interests there, and do you think that Steven Spielberg has had a recent effect on his pulling out of the 2008 Olympics in China? Do you think that's had an effect on the Chinese position with Sudan?
Well, one of the things you just touched on in your question, is very much, China's got very deep economic interest in Sudan. They're the largest foreign investor in Sudan's oil industry. They could use that role very productively. They haven't chosen to very much so far. But I think that, the Olympics is a huge deal for China. It's been described almost as their coming out party, and so I think Steven Spielberg stepping down from helping host the Olympics, helping them with that is hugely significant. And I hope that the response, ultimately will end up being productive. I think until now we've seen a lot of blustering and a lot of China talking about how how upset they are about that and how,
Yeah.
unlegitimate they think it is. But I actually think that has been an effort, of activists, a targeted effort from activists that has been extremely effective.
Okay. And what was your experience like in Darfur and Chad? And have you really been back since you've worked on the Darfur Diaries project?
Well, it's really hard to try to summarize the experience because it was so such a deep experience. I think if I have to describe in one word what struck me the most being there, it was really feeling really inspired by the people that we met. Because in the midst of all the horror that people had gone through, and in the midst of hearing and absorbing stories of people witnessing death, murder, rape, awful atrocities, what really came through was the resilience of people's spirit and their strength and their courage and their dignity. Mm-hmm. And witnessing someone's dignity being able to thrive in a situation where everything is trying to strip them of it. Mm-hmm. There's something very uplifting about that, even at the same time that bearing witness to the atrocities themselves is deeply upsetting.
Okay.
I have not been back to Darfur since we filmed. I have been back to Sudan. I was for about 2 months in South Sudan this summer, and I'm filming another film there. And the situation that is unfolding in South Sudan, it's all very connected to what's happening in Darfur, and all signs signal towards a possible reemergence of the devastating civil war in South Sudan.
Oh wow! Okay.
Which is highly alarming.
All right, and what can students do to help raise awareness on their campuses in Darfur and help try send relief to the Darfurians?
I get that question a lot, and I'm always really delighted when I get that question, because a lot of the motivation for what we're doing is to try to inspire and motivate activism. And students, I think, on this issue have really taken the lead. A lot of any of the positive moves that have happened around Darfur really started at universities and started with student groups. That being said, I'm always reluctant to try to give sort of a checklist of what to do, because I think that feeds into our desire to have everything be spoon-fed to us and be made easy, including our activism. What I'd really encourage people to do is to educate themselves more and deeper, and then to really research what are the different ways that people can get involved, and keeping in mind that when you're talking about Darfur, you can't look at Darfur in isolation. I think one of the problems of the activist movement that we've seen develop is that it's put a spotlight on Darfur, but it's been such an isolated spotlight that it's removed it from its context. And what's happening in Darfur has a historical context, a geographical context, a cultural context. It's connected to the rest of Sudan. It's connected to the rest of the region. It's connected to the Democratic Republic of Congo, where 4 million people have been killed in the last 10 years.
Oh, wow.
And so I think until we start looking at these things in a wider context and looking at what the underlying issues are that connect all these issues, we're never going to be doing more than stamping out fires rather than substantively dealing with root causes. And I don't try to say that to overwhelm people. It is absolutely, it's huge. The issues are huge, but that's why all of us need to figure out how to get engaged. And again, in a way that's a sustained struggle for the long haul, because it's really about reshaping our world.
Okay. And finally, what do you think the most important message when you present on Darfur Diaries is? What's the most important message that you really try to send to people about the project that you worked on and just about Darfur in general?
Again, it's always hard to boil it down to one, but it goes back to what I said when you asked me about my experience is the dignity of all human beings. Because I think even when we are going to see something like Darfur covered in the news, often people are reduced only as victims in what we see. You see maybe a 20-second soundbite of a refugee, and you see suffering people streaming across the borders, and that kind of portrayal, when you show someone only in their victimization, that becomes its own form of marginalization and its own form of dehumanization. So I think part of what our project is trying to do, in addition to educate people about Darfur, is to allow the people of Darfur to engage directly with audiences where you're confronting three-dimensional human beings and looking at them in their eyes and realizing that they are intelligent, articulate, have a sense of humor, the children are as important as any child that we know and love.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much for joining me today on the Rider University Network. And if you missed out on Jen's presentation in the BLC on March 11th, you can pick up a copy of her book available in the library, Darfur Diaries, and also a copy of the film Darfur Diaries, the documentary, available in the library as well. I just want to thank you once again for joining us, and goodbye.